Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Our next speaker is Professor Bob Herrick, who joins us from the Harvard School of Public Health. So he's our longest voyager today. Thank you so much for coming down. Professor Herrick broke the story about PCBs in caulk in the United States in 2005? Four. So there's a very real sense in which we owe all of this to him. Thank you, Professor Herrick.
Well, thanks to Miranda and thanks to everyone who did the organizing here. I'm sure a lot of people contributed. I don't want to try to overlook anybody by thanking anybody in particular, but I can't take credit for this really because there's someone in this room who actually played a bigger role in this than I did. And so I'm just going to make a forecast that we are going to win this. We're going to get this cleaned up. We're going to get this stuff out of the buildings. We're going to protect the teachers. We're going to protect our kids. We're going to protect the construction workers who are handling this stuff. And everybody who eventually winds up benefiting from this needs to come up here and say thank you to this gentleman sitting in the front row, Danny Lefkowitz, if you want to stand up for a second. Danny's very modest. Let me tell you why Danny deserves so much credit. I wrote the paper in 2004 that Miranda referred to. Danny sent me a fax, gave me a phone call a couple months later and said, hey, I read your paper. My son goes to elementary school right across the street. I was over and on the playground and I found these pieces of caulking on the ground and I wonder if there might be PCBs in them. Well, I'll fast forward a bit. He had the caulking tested. They were full of PCBs. The soil was contaminated, loaded with PCBs. Danny brought this to the attention of the authorities, the locals, the EPA. He basically just got a raft of shit for it, I guess would be the sort of impolite way to put it. But he didn't give up. He kept it going. And to this day, he's still an advocate for addressing this issue. Sometime when you're online, take a look at his website. It's pcbinsschools.org. All one word, pcbinsschools.org. It's the best single place to go if you want to see what's really happening. And PCBs in schools.
No, PCB.
PCB, okay, pcbinsschools.org. See, he knows it. Anyhow, thanks to Danny. I don't think he's gotten much credit for this. He's taken a hell of a lot of abuse, but thank you, Danny. I want to spend just a couple minutes and tell you that this whole PCB in buildings, especially in schools, is a story. If it were a book, it would have 4 chapters. The 4th chapter isn't finished yet, but I want to tell you what we know about the first 3. Okay, in chapter number 1, the evidence is irrefutable that PCBs are very commonly found in masonry buildings. PCBs were manufactured from about 1920s up through 1978 when they were outlawed. During that period of time worldwide, there were over 1 billion pounds of PCBs produced. 1 billion pounds. And about 10% of that went into this rubbery sort of plasticky material that you see when you look around the window frames in a building, you know, that sort of joint material that's in there. Well, that's where the PCBs wound up. Okay, so why do we care about that? Why is that important? Well, if you think about where it was used, you know, in construction mostly in the 50s through the 70s. But what was going on in the 50s through the 70s? Well, there was a heck of a lot of construction being done, and in fact, 2/3 of all the public schools in the U.S. were built during that period of time. So the chances that PCBs were used in the construction of schools is really pretty good. And so surveys that have been done in the U.S., this project that I did, a survey that was done in Switzerland, showed that about 2/3 of the school buildings were constructed during that period of time, and they have PCBs in the caulking material. So that's fact number 1. Chapter number 2 would address this question about, well, so what? I mean, it's in that material, but does that mean it's getting into the environment? Well, the answer is yes. A lot of that material is 40 or 50 years old. It's been sitting there, you know, in the weather, in the freezing, in the rain, in the sun, and you can imagine, you know, any plastic material that you can think of, is it going to last for 50 years outside? Well, no, it doesn't. It's breaking down, and it's releasing PCBs into the environment. And there's lots of good data that shows that in these buildings you have elevated air levels of PCBs, you have elevated soil contamination around the building, because these polymers that are 50 years old are breaking down. and releasing the PCBs from that rubbery material. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 would be, well, so what? I mean, does that pose a risk to the people who are in the building? Well, the answer is yes, because there's plenty of good data, Dr. Carpenter referred to this as well, that shows that not just are there elevated air levels, but the people who are in those buildings have elevated PCB levels in their blood. I've done research that shows that. It's been documented in several European countries as well. So that's what we know. There's PCBs in the buildings, the polymers are breaking down and releasing PCBs into the environment. Those PCBs are getting into the blood of the people in the building. Now, I told you the story is not finished, right? Because chapter 4 would, say, okay, well, now we can point directly to some health effect from the people being exposed to PCBs in those buildings. Dr. Carpenter reviewed, what we know about health effects from PCBs. What we don't have is direct evidence that people in those buildings have measurable health effects as a result of being in the building. But my question to you is, do we really want to wait until that question is completely answered before we do anything about it?
No.
Well, when you think about this is the last thing I'd just like to leave with you. I was reading this the other day. If you think about it, PCBs are completely synthetic compounds, okay? They don't occur in nature. They're purely man-made. You would never find these in a natural system. So why are we surprised that we don't really know much about what their toxic effects are? Because your body, natural ecosystems, plants, other animals, have never encountered this in nature. And so when the cells in your body or some other living system come across PCBs and there's some adverse effect, because they don't recognize that, they try to do something to it, but they can't metabolize it, it disrupts some natural process. Why should we be surprised that that's happening? Because these things don't occur in nature. So my point that I would leave you with is, if we're really interested in protecting people's health, I would say we should take a very conservative approach and reduce people's exposure as much as we possibly can, given what all that we know about the potential risks and the amount of exposure that people have from these buildings. So I want to leave it there. I know we'll have lots of time for questions later, but I'll just thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Herrick.